Should be going live. And with that, Mr. Wright, appreciate it, my friend. Thank you for joining us today, and really excited to have this conversation with you. Been looking forward to this for a while. As a quick way to get started, please give us a 60-second brag about yourself and a bit of background that led you to where you're at in your life today.
Okay, well, I'm Michael Wright, and I basically spent about 30 years chasing Moore's Law in the semiconductor equipment materials space. Built a couple companies along the way. One of them is wwk.com, so that tells you how early we were into the internet, three-letter acronym. It's still in business. We did all of the cost of ownership modeling for the semiconductor and solar industries, and still do quite a bit for a lot of other industries, most recently for Boeing and a couple of others. Largely covered most of the waterfront in terms of how chips are made and some of the things that you have to go through to be ready for a node or a change in the entire technology every 2 years. Because Moore's Law basically said, look, the density of a chip is going to grow every 18 months. It's going to double. And when you look at what we're able to do today and the amount of horsepower that we have or computing power that we have at our fingertips, it took a while to get there, but once we started to get there, we started to go down that exponential curve. So as chips became more dense, more computing power, we get more processing power, we get more functionality, and now we start, down the path of voice recognition, AI, machine learning, IoT, 5G, a number of things that have become possible basically because of that particular functionality in building chips. So I spend most of my time doing that, everything from startups to multi-billion-dollar market cap. So private, public, nonprofit.
What do you like the most? What's been most enjoyable for you?
Ooh, the most enjoyable is building companies and building teams. I think if you've ever experienced an electrified team, you want to revisit that as many times in your life as possible. And electrified teams are just a joy to be around. They take a long time to build. There's a lot of shared values, but primarily you make a psychologically safe environment for people to be who they are. And if you find the right people and their hearts and minds are engaged, just get out of the way. It's really a great ride.
Yeah. There's so many ways to break this down, but maybe define that a little bit more for those who this concept might be new for. Like, really, what is the exponential era?
I think it's the trend that you see if you take a look at the growth of, say, an Amazon, where nothing happens for a very long time, multiple years where they lost money, nothing really happened, and then all of a sudden they reach an inflection point and they start to take off. And then they take off on a doubling basis or a power curve, if you will. So we call it exponential, even though the mathematicians in the audience and engineers would go, hey, wait a minute, it's a power curve. And it is. But for the sake of illustration, it's a doubling. And one of the great stories that has been handed down through history is about the emperor and one of his servants, and he did a great job. The servant did a great job for the emperor, and he says, how can I pay you? He says, well, give me a grain of rice and double it every day. Right? So you have 1 the first day, 2 the second day, 4 the third day, 8, right? And it keeps going up. And at the end of it, the emperor all of a sudden realized there wasn't enough rice in the kingdom to pay him on the 30th day. So it's that type of functionality where all of a sudden you reach an inflection point, and then from an inflection point, you go to a turning point, and then from the turning point, it's a point of no return. And you see that over and over again. In the business side of things, you see it in disruption, where technologies converge, create new ecosystems, and overnight it feels like we have an entirely new growth or unicorns or whatever label you want to put to them. But if we take the taxi industry as an example, Uber, how long did it take Uber to get 40% market share of the taxi business? Just take a guess.
For 48 months?
14.
14 months?
So now if you're a classic board, who, by the way, so back up a step. If one of the other things that contrasts the exponential era is the fact that we've grown up in our strategic planning or our planning processes thinking in agrarian terms. So we use terms like seed and plant and harvest and cultivate, all the things that machines don't need. But yet we still use those terms to describe the process of our planning. Well, the problem is words are the skins of thoughts. And if you're using those words, you're thinking in those time frames, and that doesn't work. So it gets very interesting, where it kind of goes from here from an exponential era. But if you go back to the Uber idea, there's a board sitting there. The first 3 months, their first quarterly meeting, they start talking about, oh, wow, I wonder who this new Uber is. Yeah, it looks like they're, they sure planted a lot of opportunities for themselves here and there. The second board meetings, now we're 6 months in. They're going, oh my goodness, this thing is really growing. By the third quarter, they're losing massive amounts of market share. Well, who are these guys? What are we going to do about them? By the fourth time around, 12 months into the 14 months, the market's pretty well disappeared. We call those guys flash boiled frogs. After the old story of the slow boiling of the frog. In this case, there's a lot of flash boils. If you go and you look at the newspaper industry and classified advertising, that's another one where you see an example of over a 50-year period, they built a $70 billion, revenue stream. In 95, along came Craigslist. Nobody paid attention. In fact, classified advertising continued to go up for about 4 or 5 years. And then there was an inflection point. And that, of course, coincided with the capability of the cell phone and other things that allowed Craigslist to run to the front, newspapers to go to the back. But within the following 4 years, they lost nearly $50 billion of that 70 billion. And it's never come back.
In your opinion, when did that inflection point really start to take place? Whereas the exponential growth is where it is now in 2020. Like when did that curve really jet up in your opinion?
Well, I think probably if you really look at it from a technical standpoint, it's probably when we started to get into the nanometer size on chips and the functionality became so high, the processing power started to get into the gigaflops level, and we could really do things quickly. That enabled a number of other technologies. But if you go back to 2007 and you look at the iPhone, now it's interesting because Nokia had identified the cell phone as the remote control for life in 1996. They knew what the capability was, they knew what the power of it was, but they weren't really engaged in watching horizons or looking at where they were going to intercept the convergence of these technologies, whereas someone like Apple was on top of it. They were interested in displays, they were interested in interfaces and GUIs and radios and all the things that would come together in that 2005 to 2007 range that allowed them to build the iPhone. So you watch for those convergences. Where do those take place? And you can look at them from a timing standpoint and say, well, if autonomous vehicles get to this point and 3D printing gets to this point, wow, that could be an interesting combination. When will that happen? And that convergence will dramatically change logistics in this country, as an example. It's one of the things that we do is, we look for those horizons and then we develop some tools to chase them down, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess in layman's then, what does that mean for the average business out there, the average mid-sized company? And, most companies are not in the Ubers of the world. They're in some sort of mid-market marketing company or SaaS or software or oil and gas. Like, what does that mean for them? What's useful for them to take away from all of this?
I think the biggest thing for them is they're going to go digital, as a company. There's there's probably no way for them to connect with customers, suppliers, the universe at large, if you will, without going digital. And in that process, they now have to look differently about where's the competition coming from, who's adding capabilities. So let's take a simple example in COVID. The companies, or let's take a restaurant as an example, the restaurants that were prepared to be able to do online and had online capabilities early on and quickly jumped on it, were able to, carve out at least a chance of survival, depending what their following was in the first place. And obviously, depending on what the meal was. Some meals don't, really lend themselves to pick up and, that type of delivery mechanism. The food doesn't last, doesn't taste very good, but pizza is great. Others, I think have provided and figured out how to do servicing arrangements, HVAC applications where somebody's up on a roof, right? And they need a part. Well, you used to have to, come down, get on your cell phone, get on, do a search, find out, where it was, call the company, see if they had it, that sort of thing. There's now apps out there where you're sitting on the rooftop, you bring up the part number and it tells you 5 people within, 10 miles and who's got it in stock and who delivers. You don't even have to leave the roof. So I think there's those types of applications that small to medium-sized businesses need to look at what's available and also kind of where the competition might come from that they hadn't thought about. If you're a logistics company, you probably didn't think 5 years ago about Uber Freight being in your backyard or Amazon Freight. And yet you have people like FedEx and UPS and others that are thinking about it very seriously. So I think there's a bunch of ways that small to medium-sized businesses just need to look around and say, well, what could we digitize? And if we did digitize it, what would we look like? That's going to lead you to who else is coming your direction already.
Yeah, I think a lot of companies know intuitively for the last 10 years, 15 years that they should have been digitizing much more. I mean, COVID and pandemics obviously exacerbated that and forced a lot of people in that direction. I'm curious from your perspective, so a lot of these companies are going out of business. They're being subsidized by the government. And a lot of it was because of this COVID disruption. Do you feel companies should have years ago already have been prepared and have seen this coming down the pipeline by understanding and studying guys like you, and could have even been profiting during this time because they were already set up for success with all of this?
Yeah, that's a really great one. I think the challenges with an exponential era is it's counterintuitive. You have to be preparing long before. So if you weren't looking back to the iPhone, if you weren't looking at displays and the trends there, if you weren't looking at glass, if you were looking at sort of the elements of change, you probably weren't going to see it. And it is counterintuitive. The other part of it is people think they have to make big commitments early on. Actually, they need to run a lot of little experiments early on to see what's working. But I'll give you, some examples again back from the technology side. If you look at Moore's law, there's another piece that sort of adds punctuation to that in terms of shrinkage, and that's the change in wafer sizes. So 50 years ago, we started out with 1-inch wafers. Today, we have 12-inch wafers. Well, there were natural progressions switching to those. The time between going from a 2 to a 4, from a 4 to a 6, from a 6 to an 8, got longer and longer and longer. Where to go to 300 from 200 millimeter to 300 millimeter was nearly 12 years. But if you were at the beginning of that discussion, to where all the automation decisions were being made, all the standards were being developed, all the handling protocols, all the dimensions, all the things that were going into basically how are we going to move from 200 to 300, because you got to change your facility, you got to change all your robotics, you got to change all your handling, you got to change the size of chambers. So a whole industry is sitting there trying to adapt, but it takes longer. You can't go, 2 years from when Intel's going to bring up their first 300 millimeter fab that you're going to play. Isn't going to happen, is not going to happen. And I think that's part of the counterintuitive aspect of Exponential, is looking back far enough to see these trends coming, run a whole bunch of experiments, get really educated so that you're prepared when that inflection point happens. You've got things in place to take advantage of it. And I'll go back to the illustration about logistics. One of the things that we do when we look at the horizons for our clients is we use things like AI to look at the US Patent Office and look for patents. Now, that allows us to look at millions of patents and do a keyword search and a few other associations. But if you look at that and you say, well, gee, 3D printing and autonomous vehicles, that's got to be a long ways off. It ain't going to happen anytime soon. Well, let's see. People have been predicting autonomous vehicles. That's, maybe 5 to 10 years away, but 3D printing is already starting to mature. So are there going to be interim steps? Probably. But think about a fleet that's full of 3D printers, and all you're doing is resupplying raw materials. Now you have on-demand delivery. Now, if I put a little service robot on the back of it, it can pick it up and actually drive it into your shop. And if you have access, a security access, it actually deposits and leaves. You don't even need people on either end other than the driver. And the driver goes away.
Fleet, even these large fleets that are shipping materials and products, those might totally be going away because of the 3D printer.
Absolutely. Which
I
changes
thought about
logistics.
that.
So then you say, well, okay, who else is thinking about that? And if you go and do the patent research and you realize, oh, gee, Amazon's already got patents in it. Walmart's got patents, right? FedEx has got a patent or two. Strategist, which is a 3D printing company, has, some patents. And they're tied around that intersection, that convergence. And that's really where, again, you start looking earlier, you start running experiments, you start to see what are the possible combinations. And that doesn't cost a lot of money. It takes some time and some energy, but it's very low cost to go do the thought experiments that, if you will, or even go to the next level in our SPX process where you actually start to run a couple of real live experiments. That allows you to take small markets. So let's say you're a small to medium-sized business, but you've got a region. And maybe you've got offices or a presence in 15 places. You don't have to roll it out to all 15. You go try it in 1 or 2. If you get traction, try it in 3 or 4. If that looks good, now you're ready to go to roll it out to 15. But too often people do these agrarian, annualized, major planning, and we're going to get all 15, and it's this monster, and it's, ends up being, on the bookshelf. But it costs a lot of money. And so, failure gets real high. And, one of the interesting things when you look at chasing something like Moore's Law, where you literally have to create, inventions in your path. Every time there's a node, inventions in your path. So you got to figure that out. And too often people want to do the one big plan, one big idea, and that's going to save us. The reality is you have to do a whole bunch of experiments. Well, that doesn't work. Let's try this. That doesn't work. But allow yourself enough time in that before that inflection point that where you've done a bunch of experiments. You've looked at what works and what might not work so that you're prepared for the combination that is going to work when you get to that inflection point.
What are some of the other thought experiments that you have really, kind of ran through over the years that you see coming that are highly likely? Like I didn't even think about the 3D printing and logistics. Like, what are some others that actually like totally blow your mind that come top of mind for you?
I think one of them is going to be what happens with the human genome, and whether or not we're able to, can we safely experiment with that and actually roll it out, to humans. We're doing a bunch of different things with animals and body parts and things like that. And those, I think, are sort of natural evolutions. But when we start to look at behavioral modification using human genomes, that might get to be a little more of an interesting set of convergences.
Do you want zombies? Because this is how we get zombies.
This is how we get zombies, yes.
The zombie apocalypse. This is how we get the zombie apocalypse. Take it easy, Human Genome Project. Take it easy, guys. Slow down.
I'm not volunteering.
Oh man, that is a quirky one too. And you see like Elon Musk with what's the brain project that they're working on, Neuralink, with the Neuralink project. Like that's just the kind of next step in the natural cyborg evolution that we're heading in that emergence. And it's back to the Genome Project. What do you foresee are the positives out of that? What are the positive implications to innovate in that area?
Well, I think the extension of the quality of life. I don't know that we'll get to a point where, I mean, there's lots of people that talk about living to 150 years or whatever. I don't know that that's the case. Things do wear out, and I think you have a very large, complex system in the human body to try and make that work. But can you improve the quality of life over a longer period of time? Certainly, that's one of the bigger benefits. The human computer interface, that's very interesting, where that potentially can go. And, it leads to questions like, do you need a body once you've uploaded and you have the same function? In other words, if consciousness can exist similarly in two spaces, one in your head and one on a cube, what then? That gets to be pretty interesting as well, where those things can go. Right,
man. Yeah, it's interesting. It's scary to some people, but it's interesting just to think about. And I think a lot of people, some of them think about it, some of them don't even realize the implications in their day-to-day life or in their business too. Again, how many companies thought that they're gonna have to be remote, and these large co-working buildings that were built, these brick and mortar offices, like what's going to happen there? Is that going to, totally go not be part of a business model anymore in itself? And it was one of the fastest growing business models leading up to COVID.
I think you're going to see a pent up demand. There is going to be a desire to get back together and have more face-to-face time. I think we'll just do it more efficiently. There'll have to be a good reason to get together. Not so much from disease prevention, because if we're making the assumption we're post-COVID, but more from an efficiency standpoint. Do I really want to get on a plane for 10 hours or a trip for 10 hours to do a 2-hour meeting? Highly unlikely. Are there really important meetings where you want that interaction and you need it? Yes, you'll probably do those, and I think there'll be a pent-up demand for those. Whether we go back to the workspace or not, I think we will. The issue will be, what are we doing there that's different?
Uploading our cubes and just hanging out at home with our kids while half of our cube is at work all day doing its thing.
Yeah. Talk to my other brain.
Can we just ship our brain in FedEx and fly us to the Bahamas or something like that and enjoy ourselves while we're there? Yeah, it's crazy. It's and a lot of what this is going in a totally different direction than what I was expecting, but what they're starting to see and how reality works in itself, once we get ourselves uploaded to technology and kind of have that emergence, are we going to realize that the physical realm we're actually in is just a small, like a floor of an entire, 25-foot building actually, and you go to the 5th floor and there's actually a totally different experience there that you can, change yourself to. So that's really fascinating as well.
Yeah, it's like changing your Zoom background.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like would I be able to be in a beach, like feeling like I'm on a beach somewhere on vacation all day, every day, when I'm actually at work being productive and getting stuff done and in an exponential way? Yeah. Do you think about stuff like that at all? Like, would you ever do that, upload your consciousness once technology gets to that point?
Oh, I think sometimes, anybody that, spends their life looking around corners, because at mine I had to, right? You can't miss the next node. You miss the node, you're done. So I think there's a little bit of that. the pragmatic side of me says, yeah, so what? It's interesting. It's speculative. Sometimes it leads you to maybe some things to monitor or look at over the horizon that say, hey, that's getting closer. Others, I think, you're probably impractical to ever, come about. I think the idea again is that, an exponential era, and why we came up with SPX as a planning process is because it's counterintuitive. When we say exponential, everybody thinks fast, but take a look at COVID. What is the biggest fall down, or where did people lose it on COVID? The lack of preparation.
Yeah.
It wasn't in the, oh, let's chase it and go faster. It was, nobody thought about, at the inflection point, what do we have to have in place? And you start that years in advance. Now, it's interesting also, back in the 2005 to 2008 timeframe, the Department of Defense and others were actually running scenarios on pandemics. So we knew, we just didn't act, which is another challenge that you have. This constant contrast behind, you're looking farther and farther onto the horizon, you're running little experiments, but you're not really executing yet. So that becomes another tricky point, is when should you be looking at real execution? Well, you have to have enough things in place, right, that if it's sprung on you or something happens, that you're prepared to make the change.
So break that down a little bit further, that SPX process. We've talked about that. What are some of the principles there that a visionary business leader, business owner, even a department head can understand?
Great question. So in simple terms, you're creating a flywheel with separate components that add or contribute to the momentum of that flywheel. And so your planning process becomes continuous instead of annualized. You're just constantly doing some things. And one of the first things you do is take a look at over the horizon what's coming. And you can use things like we talked about, the AI IP type of thing. And you've got the other things where you're looking at, the normal feed of industry data, Salesforce, marketing, others that are trying to, give you a sort of a semblance of what's the customer thinking about, where's the customer going, what might the customer use in the future? Are there other technologies the customer might adopt that we can build off of? So you begin to think in those terms. The other part of it is you're trying to look at the timing of different things. We'll go back to the iPhone and 2007, and technologies coming together. And when they come together, it starts to open up a convergence window. When that window opens up, that's your inflection. And you better be there, because if you're not there, it moves on, and it moves on quickly. So that's one thing, is to look over the horizon. The next thing is, out of those insights, you start to do experiments, and you start to look at, well, if that's going to happen, let's try this and see how that works. Well, let's put these three things together and see how the customers play. And then, like I said earlier, once you start down that path, you get a couple of good hits or wins. You say, let's try it a little bit bigger. Then you go to scale it or drop it.
So an example would be like a service that might be something that your competitors start taking advantage of in the next 3 years. But because you're looking around the corner, looking at the horizons, now you start experimenting, testing with your client base, testing with your market, seeing what catches, what people will, jump onto.
Exactly. And try to do it not in the knee-jerk fashion, which is a typical response, because then you're chasing the train. And if the train builds up too much momentum, you'll never catch it. So it's doing it early enough, doing it at a small enough cost factor, if you will. I have a couple of friends of mine that sit on a board of a pretty good sensor company. It's an engineering group. And they sort of do this like every other Thursday. They get together and they talk about the future. What about this? So that allowed them, they were up really early on blockchain, and one of the first companies to actually incorporate it in their sensors. So they got a big leap, once, the pieces came together.
Fascinating. Well, Michael, anything else that you think is top of mind and take actionable and valuable that we should touch on over here?
Yeah, I think, companies need to really look at what is their planning process. And if it is using words that are agrarian based, you probably have the wrong process. If you're still talking seed, cultivate, harvest, cash cow, yeah, that may not suit you very well. You may want to be looking at horizons and innovations and technologies and digital transformation and other words like that in your vocabulary. The other is the volume at velocity, which is another sort of a real mark of the exponential era. You look at the volume and velocity of COVID's spread, and that gives you a sense of what exponential is.
And that's how we should position our businesses.
Yeah. Be prepared because it's coming to an industry near you.
Yeah. Yeah. I like it. A little fun fear there, I guess.
Yes, it is.
Well, cool.
Well, think about it. If you get ahead of it, you win.
How can people continue to find you, follow you? You got a new book coming out. Make sure you drop that and talk about that real quick.
Yeah, The Exponential Era is the name of the book, obviously. It's going to be published by Wiley. Should come out in November. Pre-order, if you're in England, you can pre-order it now. But pre-order is probably somewhere in the September, October timeframe, and probably an electronic version later in October, but definitely it's going to be out early November. And I think it'll be really helpful. It'll put exponential in perspective. It'll put the SPX process in front of people. I think it'll ask them some fairly deep questions as well that we didn't touch on. But in technologies, we're launching all these technologies, but we haven't really thought through who's accountable for the outcomes. That's a whole nother podcast.
I'm really tempted to jump on that, but we'll save that for another podcast. Yeah. Well, great. Well, Michael, pleasure as always. Thank you so much for stopping by and chatting through that today. And all of you listening, make sure again, go subscribe. We're on all your favorite podcast apps. Leave a 5-star review so others can find the show too. And we'll see you over on the